One of the first upgrades that people make in RC is the transmitter. And it's also one of the places where money gets wasted. So between like spec sheets, there's brand hype, pro level marketing, beginners end up buying something that's just too much that they don't need. By the end of this video, you're gonna know what actually matters and what things you can ignore and be just fine. So let's dive right on in. This is what most people start with, is the RTR transmitter that comes with their first RC. Now, don't get me wrong, this is just fine. It gets you going, it gets you hooked, but this is quite basic. And as you get hooked on the hobby, you want more features, your collection starts to grow. Heck, you might even dive into building a kit. And this isn't designed to grow with the hobby, it's merely there to get you started. So here's the mindset shift before we get going that saves people money. More expensive isn't always better. Now keep in mind, this is something that's not a gadget you're buying. You're buying into a system that's going to grow as you expand into the hobby. So let's talk about what actually matters once you make the upgrade. So there's a few key things. First thing is going to be reliability and your signal, right? This is supposed to be what controls your RC. Hence why you also hear them called a controller, not just a transmitter. So that's the first thing, is looking at something that has a reliable signal. The next thing to consider are the number of channels. Now the sweet spot here for most users is probably going to be about that 4 to 6 channel range. So let's take an example of the VS410 Phoenix. You see me pull this thing out all the time, one of my babies. But with this, there's a number of things you can add on. Everybody needs, 2 channels. That's the most basic. But if you're crawling, you're probably going to want to add a winch to your crawler. You might even be adding other things like being able to turn your light kits on and off through your transmitter. You might even be adding things like dig and some other features we'll drop into a future video. So look for something that probably has 4 to 6 channels. That way it gives you some future proofing as well. Okay, so to build on that, so you have, we just talked about the channels. The other thing, and this is where a lot of people get burned when they're making the upgrade, is the receiver ecosystem. So the Pro with the multi-model memory, which we'll talk about as one of the things to look at, can also be overhyped, is that you're buying a receiver so you only have to have one transmitter with multiple cars. Now receivers, depending on the brand, some of these receivers can get to be quite spendy, where others are a little bit more economical. You also want to look at availability, because let's face it, you buy a new kit, you're excited, you have your transmitter, but then you can't find the receiver you need, or it's overseas somewhere and it's going to take a month to get there. That's no fun. So I would look for brands that you can see that find that balance of the pricing's pretty good for the most part, and the receivers are widely available for when you need them. The last thing that I would look at, though this is subjective and probably the least important of these, are the ergonomics. So I would maybe look at like where your extra little auxiliary switches are located, like here on this Spektrum. You can see that they're right around the wheel, which is convenient if you're running a winch or like a 2-speed transmission or something like that. Having those nice and convenient, great. Maybe the feel of the wheel, the trigger. A lot of these transmitters even have customizability in the grips. You could even move the wheel over to the other side and run it lefty if you're left-handed, versus having to run it upside down. Again, this is more subjective and is kind of the least important, but that's one of the other big things that I would look out for. Now let's talk about some things that are overhyped out there in the world of transmitters. Okay, let's talk about some overhyped features now that really shouldn't matter too much. Now in this day and age, most all aftermarket or upgrade transmitters, whether it be, here's my older Spektrum, a little bit higher end Noble, Most every transmitter comes with at least like 15 to 20 model memory. So with that, you'll start seeing some manufacturers be like, oh, I have like a 30, 40 model memory. That doesn't really matter. I know very few hobbyists that even own 20 vehicles. And the ones that get up into that 20 vehicle range typically have more than one transmitter because they want to run certain vehicles on one, or they want to have a spare to have their buddies run, or they might even have certain cars that have special use cases, which we'll talk about later, that might require a little something else. So don't give much credence if the model memory they're boasting and advertising that it's like 30, 40, 50. You'll never get there. It's not worth the extra money. The last feature that I would tell you can be a little overhyped. Now, there are certain use cases for it, and if what you're doing meets the use case, then maybe you look into it. And that's different telemetry features. So I've been in this hobby probably close to 16 years now. And even as an experienced hobbyist, there are very few times, and I have had very few use cases where things like telemetry have really been one of those make or break things. So when you're looking at a transmitter, you know, it might be important to you, but if you're getting going and you're still trying to future-proof a little bit, telemetry is probably one of those things that might not be as big of a deal and not something to get too caught up in. So let's talk about brands a little bit. Now, I don't want to sit here and endorse a specific brand or, you know, talk smack on a certain brand because I can see, you know, those keyboard warriors getting ready to go. But I want to show some effects of choosing a good transmitter. So any of y'all that might be watching it that have been in the hobby for a minute know that this good old Spektrum transmitter here is old. This thing I've had probably 10 plus years, and it has served me well. I've used this thing for crawlers, and Spektrums are great crawler radios. They have, you know, easy availability to get receivers, and so the thing has aged well with me, and I've been able to kind of have that buy once, cry once with it. But with that said, you know, there are certain use cases where this is probably not the best choice. So I have Noble NB4 Plus here. Now this has a special, a little bit better, or a little bit more of a special use case. If you're getting into like racing, or especially drift cars, the Noble is probably the better choice when you're going Spektrum versus Noble, or, you know, maybe even some other higher end systems like the Futabas. So, you know, I would also look at what your predominant part of the hobby that you're into, and also look at other places in the hobby that you're considering going into, and look and see, you know, people in your area, what they're running, to buy the one that fits your needs. Again, the Spektrum is not a bad radio. As I said, you know, I've had this one specifically for 10 years. They're still making great radios in the crawler world. One of the best choices that you can make. And a lot of axial radios come with a basic version of the Spektrum as well. So great, but, you know, if you have another use case, this other transmitter might be the better way to go. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about like the high-end boundary, and you're questioning, and you see that $1,000 Futaba and you're like, oh sweet. Or, you know, I have this Noble NB4 Plus sitting here. I mean, this starts to get into the more high-end. You're in that $3,000 to $5,000 to $1,000 range. These are great, but I would stop and question, do you need all of those features? These are usually people that are buying these are racers, competitive drift drivers, they're sponsored, they have these unique needs that would demand some of those higher end features that most of us are never going to use. So, you know, let's take it back. If you're watching my channel, you're probably a little bit more into that crawler realm, and really what you need to get by is going to be something, you know, it's in that 4 to 6 channel, has the 15 to 20 model memory, and you can get an excellent radio for less money than what these higher end radios are gonna cost and be perfectly happy and not even need the features that you'd be spending that extra money on. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these higher end features maybe in a future video if you guys comment and say, you know, do something on a high-end video. All right, let's bring it on in and talk about logic here with the information we've covered. So you're doing your first upgrade or you're into crawlers. Put a little bit bigger emphasis on the number of channels. You know, shoot for that 4 to 6, 7 channel sweet spot. You're looking to grow your collection, or you have a few different cars already in your fleet and you want to consolidate to one transmitter. Then start putting a little bit more weight on the price and the availability of the receivers. Now, I'll link a few different transmitters that I would recommend and use down in the description. They are an affiliate link, but I'm only going to recommend the things that I trust. So with that, y'all, that brings us to an end. I appreciate you watching till the end. And let me know in the comments if you would like me to make a video about when to consider upgrading to something high-end. And with that, y'all, we'll see you on the next one.